The night sky over Okinawa burned with a light that had no place in nature. Colonel Yahara Hiromichi crouched in the limestone cave that served as headquarters for the Japanese 32nd Army, feeling the heat press against the entrance like an invisible hand. It was the 20th day of May, 1945, and the Americans had brought their liquid fire again. This was not the honorable combat he had trained for at the Imperial Japanese Army Academy. This was something else entirely, something that defied every principle of Bushido, every assumption about how wars were fought. The Americans did not simply kill you. They burned you alive in your defensive positions, cooked you in your own fortifications, turned your sanctuary into an oven. "Sir, the forward positions at Shuri Castle are reporting." The young lieutenant's voice cracked. He was perhaps 20 years old, his face smudged with volcanic ash and something darker. "They're requesting permission to abandon the tunnels. The fire is coming through the ventilation shafts." If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Yahara closed his eyes. Permission to abandon. As if there were anywhere left to go. As if the whole island wasn't being systematically burned clean of Japanese defenders by those cursed American flame tanks and their endless supplies of jellied gasoline. The weapon had a name now. The Americans called it napalm, a simple word for an extraordinary horror. It clung to everything it touched. It burned hotter than any conventional fire. Worst of all, when the American Sherman tanks rolled forward with their flame projectors, there was no defense. Artillery couldn't stop them. Rifle fire was useless. Even when Japanese soldiers made suicidal charges with magnetic mines, more flame tanks appeared the next day, as if the Americans had an inexhaustible supply. Yahara had fought in China. He had studied warfare in Europe through intelligence reports. He understood combined arms tactics, logistics, the calculus of casualties. But this was something his education had not prepared him for. This was industrial slaughter, refined to a science, and the science was perfection itself from the American perspective. "Tell the garrison at Shuri to withdraw to the secondary positions," Yahara said finally. Another retreat, another line given up. The island was only 67 miles long, and they had been fighting for 50 days. How much longer could they hold? The answer, he suspected, was not much longer. Not against an enemy who had solved the problem of dug-in defenders so completely. 6 months earlier, Colonel Yahara had been relatively confident. Not confident of victory. That hope had died somewhere in the Philippine Sea when the Imperial Japanese Navy lost its carrier force, but confident that Japan could extract such a terrible price for every foot of ground that the Americans would eventually negotiate rather than fight. The strategy was simple: defense in depth, using Okinawa's natural cave systems and the months the garrison had spent preparing defensive positions. Every cave was a fortress. Every hill was honeycombed with tunnels. The Americans would have to dig them out one position at a time, and each would cost them hundreds, perhaps thousands of casualties. Lieutenant General Ushijima Mitsuru, commanding the 32nd Army, had been explicit in his orders. "We will defend Okinawa to the last man. Every cave will become a tomb for American Marines. Every position will require them to pay in blood." Yahara had believed it was possible. The Americans had struggled at Peleliu, at Iwo Jima. The caves had given them trouble. The defensive tunnels had worked. Why should Okinawa be different? Then the Americans brought their fire. The first time Yahara saw the flame tanks in action was on the first day of April. American forces had landed on the western beaches near Hagushi with shocking ease. Ushijima had deliberately left the beaches lightly defended, preferring to draw the enemy into prepared positions inland. The American advance had been cautious at first, probing, expecting resistance. Then they had reached the first line of caves near Kakazu Ridge. Yahara had watched through field glasses from his headquarters position as the American infantry approached the ridge. The caves there housed nearly a full battalion, 700 men with machine guns, mortars, and enough ammunition and supplies to hold for weeks. The approach was open ground. Any attack would be murderous. The Americans did not attack with infantry. Instead, a different kind of the tank rolled forward. It looked like a standard Sherman at first, but Yahara noticed the modifications immediately. The unusual turret configuration, the tube where a machine gun should be, the careful way American infantry stayed well back from its path. The tank paused 60 meters from the cave entrance. There was a sound like tearing cloth, and then a stream of fire shot from the tank. Not bullets, not shells, but liquid fire that arced through the air in a horrifying orange-black tongue. The stream hit the cave mouth and splashed inward. For a moment nothing happened. Then smoke began pouring from every crack and fissure in the hillside. And then the screaming started. Japanese soldiers emerged from the cave, their uniforms on fire, their weapons forgotten. Some tried to roll on the ground, others simply ran blindly. American riflemen cut them down, a mercy, perhaps, compared to burning alive. The tank moved to the next cave, and the next, and the next. By nightfall, Kakazu Ridge was silent. 700 men gone in less than 6 hours. That was when Yahara understood the nature of the threat they faced. The Americans called them Zippo tanks, after their cigarette lighters. The nickname felt obscene to Yahara, as if this weapon of terror were something casual, something to be joked about. But perhaps that was the point. Perhaps the psychological effect was intentional, because the effect on Japanese defenders was profound. Yahara had seen soldiers face artillery with courage. He had seen men charge machine gun positions without hesitation. The willingness to die for the emperor was absolute among the garrison. But the flame tanks broke something in even the most dedicated soldiers. It was the nature of the death they offered. A bullet killed you quickly. Shrapnel might wound you, but you could be evacuated, treated. Even a direct artillery hit was over in an instant. But fire was different. Fire consumed you slowly. Fire offered no dignity, no honor. Fire turned you into something less than human, a burning thing that screamed and flailed and died in agony while your comrades watched, unable to help. The Americans understood this. Yahara was certain of it. The flame tanks weren't just weapons. They were psychological warfare instruments designed to destroy the will to resist. And they worked. Reports reached headquarters daily of positions abandoning their defenses when flame tanks approached. Not because the men were cowards. Yahara would shoot any officer who suggested such a thing, but because the human instinct for self-preservation was stronger than any training when faced with that particular death. Sir, intelligence report from the observation post. A new officer appeared at Yahara's elbow, holding a message slip. The Americans are bringing more flame tanks forward. Reconnaissance counts 24 in the assembly area near Naha. 24. Yahara felt a weight settle in his chest. 24 flame tanks against what remained of the southern defensive line. Against caves that could not be sealed. Against tunnels that became death traps when the fire came through. How many do we have operational? Yahara asked. Sir, how many flame tanks does the 32nd Army possess? The officer looked confused. We have no flame tanks, sir. The Imperial Japanese Army does not use such weapons. No, Yahara thought. We have honor instead. We have Bushido. We have the willingness to die for the Emperor. But we do not have flame tanks. The mathematics of the situation were brutally simple. Japan's strategy for the decisive Battle of Okinawa had assumed certain constants, that defensive positions in caves could be held indefinitely, that each position would require significant American casualties to reduce, that the accumulation of casualties would eventually make the invasion of the Japanese home islands unacceptable to the American public. The flame tanks had invalidated all of those assumptions. A cave that could hold 100 men indefinitely against conventional attack could be neutralized in minutes by a flame tank. The American casualties were minimal. Flame tank crews operated at standoff distances, and even when Japanese soldiers made suicidal rushes at the tanks, the infantry protecting them cut the attackers down before they could close the distance. Yahara had done the calculations. At the current rate of attrition, the 32nd Army would be combat ineffective in less than 30 days. Not destroyed entirely, there would still be isolated groups fighting from caves and tunnels, but unable to conduct organized resistance. And then the Americans would move north, toward the home islands, toward Kyushu, toward Tokyo. The thought filled Yahara with a despair he had never felt before, not even after the fall of Saipan, not even after the destruction of the combined fleet. Because if the Americans brought their flame weapons to the Japanese home islands, what defense could possibly stop them? Japan's cities were built of wood and paper. The people were packed into dense urban areas. The Americans had already demonstrated their willingness to burn cities in China. What would they do to Tokyo, to Osaka, to Kyoto? And if they brought the flame tanks, if they landed on Kyushu with these weapons, how could civilian militia armed with bamboo spears possibly resist? On the 31st day of May, American forces broke through the last major defensive line at Shuri. The 32nd Army retreated south toward the Kion Peninsula, the last redoubt, the final position. Yahara moved his headquarters into a cave complex near Hill 89. The Americans were close now. He could hear the sound of their tanks during the day, the rumble of their artillery at night, and he could smell the napalm, that particular chemical stench, like gasoline mixed with soap, that preceded the fire. The reports that reached him were increasingly desperate. The 44th Independent Mixed Brigade had ceased to exist as a fighting unit, burned out of their positions near Itomen. The 9th Division was down to less than 20% strength. Even the cracked 24th Division, which had fought so brilliantly at Kakazu Ridge in April, was shattered. But the men who remained fought on, not because they believed they could win. That illusion was long gone, but because there was nothing else to do. Surrender was not an option. The Emperor's orders were absolute, and perhaps in some way fighting to the death in the caves of Okinawa was preferable to imagining what would come next, because Yahara could imagine it clearly now. He could see the American flame tanks rolling through the streets of Tokyo. He could envision the napalm bombs falling on Osaka, on Hiroshima, on Nagasaki. He could picture the home islands burning from end to end, and there would be nothing Japan could do to stop it. "Colonel," one of his staff officers said quietly, "there's a rumor." "What rumor?" "The Americans have a new weapon. Something beyond the flame tanks. Something—" The officer hesitated. "The rumors say it's a bomb that can destroy an entire city." Yahara almost laughed. "A bomb that could destroy an entire city? Impossible. Even the largest conventional bombs the B-29s carried, the 2,000-pounders, could only destroy a few buildings at most. But then he had thought flame tanks were impossible too before he saw them. "Where did this rumor originate?" "From the civilians, sir. They say the Americans have been testing it, that it has something to do with splitting the atom." Splitting the atom. Yahara remembered hearing about atomic research before the war. Theoretical physics, quantum mechanics, things that existed primarily in university laboratories. The idea that such research could produce a practical weapon seemed absurd, and yet the Americans had done so many things that seemed absurd. They had built thousands of ships. They had trained millions of soldiers. They had developed these flame weapons that turned caves into ovens. Why should an atomic bomb be any more impossible than anything else they had achieved? Even if such a weapon exists, Yahara said slowly, it would only be used once, perhaps twice, a demonstration. The Americans would want to show their power to force negotiation. Yes, sir. But the flame weapons, those they will use everywhere. Every cave, every tunnel, every defensive position from Okinawa to Hokkaido. That is the true threat. Because that was what kept Yahara awake in his cave at night. Not the fantasy of atomic superweapons, but the very real, very present horror of napalm. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Americans had solved the problem of how to kill defenders in fortified positions without suffering significant casualties themselves. They had turned defense into a death trap, and they clearly had the industrial capacity to produce these weapons in unlimited quantities. Yahara had seen intelligence reports of napalm production figures that defied belief. 8 million pounds manufactured in 1944 alone. How much would they produce in 1945? 20 million pounds? 50 million? Enough to burn every cave in Japan. Enough to turn the home islands into a crematorium. That was the nightmare that haunted Colonel Yahara Hiromichi as he sat in his cave headquarters on Okinawa, listening to the sounds of American tanks approaching through the darkness. Not some theoretical atomic weapon that might or might not exist, but the very real fire that had already consumed tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers, and would soon consume him too. The 14th day of March, 1945. 6 weeks before Colonel Yahara would witness the American invasion of Okinawa, Lieutenant Sakai Takashi of the Tokyo Metropolitan Police Department stood in what had once been the Asakusa district and tried to comprehend the scale of destruction around him. There was nothing left. Nothing. Where 5 days ago there had been neighborhoods, shops, temples, homes, where 300,000 people had lived and worked, there was now only ash and twisted metal. The Sumida River was choked with bodies. The bridges had collapsed. The air still smelled of burned wood, burned cloth, burned flesh. Sakai had served in China. He had seen bombing damage before. But this was different. This wasn't destruction. It was erasure. 16 square miles of Tokyo simply gone, as if a god had reached down and wiped the city clean. How many? Someone asked behind him. Another officer, his uniform still pristine, newly arrived from a district the Americans had not yet touched. The official count is 83,793 dead, Sakai heard himself say. The number felt obscene in its precision, as if counting mattered, as if the difference between 83,000 and 84,000 meant anything when entire neighborhoods had ceased to exist. And the wounded? 40,000 officially, but many more will die. The burns. Sakai couldn't finish. He had seen the survivors, if you could call them that, people with flesh hanging from their arms in sheets, children whose faces had melted, men and women who would take days to die, screaming for water that would not come. What kind of bombs do this? Sakai turned to look at the younger officer. He seemed genuinely puzzled, as if he expected a technical answer that would make the destruction comprehensible. Firebombs, Sakai said. The Americans call them M69 incendiaries. They drop them in clusters. 38 bomblets per cluster bomb. Each bomblet contains napalm. It's a jellied gasoline that sticks to everything and burns at temperatures over 2,000 degrees. But surely our air defenses... We had 8,000 firemen for the entire Tokyo metropolitan area, Sakai interrupted. 8,000 men, 1,000 pieces of equipment, 3 extension ladders. 3. For a city of 7 million people. The younger officer fell silent, and the Americans sent 334 bombers. Sakai continued, his voice flat. 279 reached the target. They came in low, 7,000 feet instead of their usual 30,000. They came at night. They stripped their planes of defensive armament to carry more bombs. Each plane carried 7 tons of incendiaries. He pointed at the devastation stretching to the horizon. 1,665 tons of napalm, dropped in less than 3 hours. The fires created their own weather. Thermal updrafts so powerful they ripped roofs off buildings that weren't even burning yet. The canals boiled. Metal melted. People burst into flames spontaneously from the radiant heat. Sakai had been on duty when the raid began. He had been in the Honjo ward, east of the Sumida River, when the Pathfinder aircraft dropped their marking fires. He had seen the X-pattern of flames that guided the following waves of bombers. He had watched the sky turn orange, then red, then white as the firestorm built. And he had heard the screaming that went on for hours. "Why this district?" the younger officer asked. "Was there a military target here?" Sakai almost laughed. "Small factories, cottage industries that make parts for larger manufacturers, machine shops. The Americans targeted the working-class districts deliberately. High population density, wood and paper construction, perfect conditions for creating a firestorm. That's targeting civilians." "Yes, but that violates." "It violates nothing," Sakai said wearily. "Or it violates everything. Take your pick." The Americans decided that the fastest way to destroy Japan's industrial capacity is to kill the workers and burn their homes. And they're right. Half of Tokyo's industrial output came from this area. Now it's gone. The younger officer looked sick. Sakai understood. He had felt the same way on the morning of the 10th of March, walking through streets that were still hot enough to burn through the soles of his boots, seeing things that would never leave his memory. "Is this what they'll do to the rest of Japan?" the younger officer asked quietly. Sakai didn't answer immediately. Instead, he thought about the reports that had reached police headquarters over the past week. Reports from Nagoya, where the Americans had firebombed the city just 3 days after Tokyo. Reports from Osaka, from Kobe. The pattern was clear. "Yes," he said finally, "they're going to burn every major city in Japan, and there's nothing we can do to stop them." In his office at the Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo, General Anami Korochika studied the damage reports with growing alarm. As War Minister and a member of the Supreme Council for the Direction of the War, he had access to information that was kept from the general public, and that information painted a picture that was difficult to accept. Tokyo had lost 16 square miles, 100,000 dead, perhaps more, 1 million homeless. But Tokyo was just the beginning. On the 11th of March, Nagoya had been hit. 274 B-29s had dropped nearly 2,000 tons of incendiaries on the city. 2 square miles destroyed. On the 13th of March, Osaka, 300 bombers, 8 square miles burned. On the 16th of March, Kobe, 331 bombers, nearly 3 square miles destroyed, and the Americans were just getting started. Anami laid the reports aside and walked to the window. Tokyo stretched before him, but now he saw it differently. He saw not a city, but fuel, wood, paper, tightly packed neighborhoods. 7 million people living in structures that would burn like kindling when the Americans returned. Because they would return. That much was certain. The question was not whether Japan could defend against these raids. The question was whether Japan could survive them. Anami was a soldier. He had fought in Manchuria, in China. He understood conventional warfare, the movement of armies, the taking of ground, the calculus of advantage and disadvantage. But this was something new. This was war waged directly against the civilian population, with the explicit goal of destroying the nation's ability to produce weapons, feed its people, house its workers. And it was working. The cabinet had received reports from factory managers across Tokyo. Production had fallen by 40% since the March 9th raid. Not because the factories themselves had been destroyed. Many of the large industrial facilities had been outside the burn zone, but because the workers were dead or injured or homeless, or simply too traumatized to return to work. How did you maintain industrial production when your workforce was fleeing the cities? How did you build aircraft when the workers who made the aluminum parts no longer had homes to return to at night? How did you manufacture ammunition when the supply chain had been disrupted by the destruction of transportation infrastructure? The Americans had found a way to attack Japan's war-making capacity without ever having to land troops on Japanese soil. They simply burned the cities until there was nothing left to support military operations. Anami turned back to his desk and picked up another report. This one was from the Kempeitai, the military police. It detailed the growing panic among civilians in major cities. People were evacuating to the countryside without permission. Factory managers reported that absenteeism had tripled. There were rumors, dangerous rumors, that the government had no defense against the American bombers, that the war was already lost. The report recommended harsh measures to maintain public morale, arrests, public executions of defeatists, stronger propaganda emphasizing the importance of dying for the emperor rather than fleeing. Anami set the report aside without signing it. What was the point? You couldn't shoot morale into people. You couldn't execute your way to victory when 300 American bombers could destroy a city in a single night. His thoughts turned to the home island's defense. The plan, Operation Ketsugo, called for the entire civilian population to resist an American invasion. Every man, woman, and child would be mobilized, bamboo spears, homemade explosives, suicide attacks. The Americans would be made to pay such a terrible price for every inch of Japanese soil that they would eventually negotiate rather than fight. But what if they never invaded? What if they simply sat offshore and burned every city in Japan to the ground? What if they destroyed the entire nation from the air before a single American soldier set foot on Japanese soil? The strategy of making the invasion too costly assumed there would be an invasion. But the Americans were showing them a different path, a path of fire that required no ground combat, no landing craft, no exposed Marines on Hiroshima beaches, just bombers and napalm and time. By June of 1945, the firebombing campaign had taken on a systematic character that made its true nature unmistakable. The Americans had moved beyond attacking major cities and were now methodically working their way through medium and smaller urban areas. In the operations room at Imperial General Headquarters, staff officers tracked the raids on a large map of Japan. Red pins marked cities that had been attacked. Black pins marked cities that no longer existed as functional urban centers. The red pins were everywhere. The black pins were multiplying. Tokyo had been hit multiple times, additional raids in April and May, adding to the devastation of March. Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe had all been struck repeatedly. But now the Americans were burning cities that most Japanese had barely heard of. Toyama, 99% of the city destroyed. Fukui, 80% destroyed. Tokushima, 67% destroyed. Gifu, 63% destroyed. The numbers became almost abstract in their enormity. But for the staff officers tracking the campaign, the pattern was clear. The Americans were deliberately destroying Japan's urban infrastructure. Every city with a population over 60,000, every industrial center, no matter how small, every port, every rail hub, every manufacturing town. Commander Nakajima Tadashi, a naval officer attached to the general staff, had been given the task of analyzing the American bombing campaign and projecting its future course. His report, delivered to the Supreme Council in late June, was grimly precise. The Americans have firebombed 64 cities to date, Nakajima reported. Current estimates place total civilian casualties at over 300,000 dead and 8 million homeless. 40% of Japan's urban area has been destroyed. The council members listened in silence. These were not men easily shocked. They had overseen a war that had killed millions, but the scale of the destruction was difficult to process. At the current rate, Nakajima continued, the Americans will have destroyed every significant urban center in Japan by September. Our industrial capacity is already reduced by 50%. Food distribution has been severely disrupted. Transportation infrastructure is failing. The civilian population is approaching the breaking point. What about our air defenses? Someone asked. Ineffective. The Americans fly at night, at low altitude. Our fighters cannot locate them in the darkness. Our anti-aircraft guns lack the radar guidance necessary for accurate fire. We shoot down perhaps 2 or 3 bombers per raid, losses the Americans can easily sustain. Meanwhile, they destroy entire cities. Can we evacuate the remaining population centers? Nakajima shook his head. To where? The countryside is already overcrowded with refugees from previous raids. Agricultural production is barely sufficient to feed the existing rural population. Adding millions more would result in mass starvation. General Anami spoke up. What about the defense of the home islands? Can we maintain Operation Ketsugo if the bombing continues? Nakajima hesitated. This was the question that mattered most, the question that cut to the heart of Japan's strategy for continuing the war. If the Americans invade now, he said carefully, we can mount significant resistance. We have 2 million troops under arms, adequate weapons stockpiles, sufficient ammunition for several months of intense combat. The civilian militia can be equipped with whatever weapons we have available. It would be bloody, but we could make them pay dearly. And if they wait, if they continue bombing for another 3 months, 6 months, then Operation Ketsugo becomes impossible. Our weapons factories will be destroyed. Our ammunition stockpiles will be depleted through attrition. Our transportation network will be unable to move troops to where they're needed. Most critically, the civilian population will be too demoralized, too hungry, and too scattered to resist effectively. Anami absorbed this. So the bombing campaign is designed to make an invasion unnecessary, or to make it far less costly when it does come. Either way, the Americans are destroying our ability to resist through strategic bombing alone. Colonel Yahara, trapped in his cave on Okinawa, knew nothing of the firebombing campaign consuming the home islands. Radio communications with Tokyo had become sporadic, and when they did get through, the messages focused on tactical matters rather than strategic updates. But he could infer the truth from the silence itself. The promised reinforcements never came. The air support that was supposed to arrive never materialized. The Navy fleet that was meant to disrupt American supply lines had vanished. Japan was losing the war not through defeat in battle, but through the systematic destruction of its capacity to fight. And the weapon that was accomplishing this was not advanced technology or brilliant strategy, but simply fire applied in overwhelming quantities. On the 22nd day of June, Lieutenant General Ushijima committed seppuku in his headquarters cave, fulfilling the promise he had made to fight to the last. Yahara, as chief of staff, was ordered to survive and report on the battle to Imperial headquarters. Yahara refused at first. To survive when his commander died felt dishonorable, but Ushijima had been explicit. Someone needed to tell the general staff what had happened on Okinawa, needed to explain how American tactics had evolved, needed to warn them about what was coming. So Yahara surrendered, one of fewer than 10,000 Japanese soldiers on Okinawa to do so. The rest, more than 100,000 men, died fighting or by their own hand. On the transport ship taking him back to Japan, Yahara spoke with other survivors, and for the first time learned the full extent of what had happened to the home islands while he had been fighting on Okinawa. The firebombing campaign, 67 cities destroyed, 300,000 dead, 8 million homeless. He learned that the flame weapons he had faced on Okinawa, the tanks that had burned Japanese soldiers out of their caves, had consumed 200,000 gallons of napalm just in that single battle, and that the Americans had used vastly more in their strategic bombing campaign, dropping thousands of tons of incendiaries on Japanese cities. He learned that the Americans had developed a napalm production capacity that seemed unlimited. 8 million pounds produced in 1944. Projections suggested 40 million pounds or more for 1945, and he learned that there was no defense against it, no tactic that worked, no strategy that could stop it. Japan's military leadership had assumed that their willingness to die would make invasion too costly. They had assumed that defense in depth, fanatical resistance, and the sacrifice of the entire population would eventually force the Americans to negotiate. But the Americans weren't negotiating. They were simply burning Japan city by city, reducing the entire nation to ash, and there was nothing, absolutely nothing, the Imperial Japanese Army could do about it. By late July of 1945, the situation had become desperate enough that even the most hardline militarists in the government were beginning to discuss terms of surrender. Not public discussions. Such talk would be treason, but private conversations, quiet suggestions, tentative explorations of whether there might be a way to end the war that preserved the emperor and prevented the complete annihilation of the Japanese nation. The Americans had issued a declaration from Potsdam demanding unconditional surrender. Japan's government had ignored it officially, but behind closed doors, members of the Supreme Council debated whether continuing the war served any purpose beyond the nation's complete destruction. The firebombing had achieved what military defeat had not. It had broken the will of Japan's leadership. Not because they feared death, that was acceptable, even honorable, but because they saw no path to anything resembling victory or even favorable terms. The Americans were demonstrating that they could destroy Japan without ever having to invade, without ever having to risk significant casualties. What was the point of fighting on when the enemy had found a way to wage war that made your resistance irrelevant? And then, on the 6th day of August, everything changed. The news reached Tokyo in fragments at first. A single American bomber had struck Hiroshima. There had been a tremendous explosion. The entire city had been destroyed. Not burned, but destroyed, reduced to rubble in an instant. Casualties were catastrophic. At first, the government assumed it was some new type of incendiary weapon, a massive firebomb, perhaps, or multiple bombs dropped simultaneously. But as reconnaissance aircraft flew over Hiroshima, a different picture emerged. One bomb, one aircraft, one city destroyed. The mushroom cloud had been visible from 100 miles away. The blast had leveled buildings 5 miles from the hypocenter. The heat had been so intense that shadows of human beings had been burned into walls. And there was something else, something the doctors treating survivors couldn't identify. a sickness that came days after the blast, killing people who seemed to have survived the initial explosion. The Americans called it an atomic bomb. They claimed it was the equivalent of 20,000 tons of conventional explosives in a single weapon. They promised that more were coming unless Japan surrendered immediately. General Anami studied the reports from Hiroshima with a sense of unreality. 70,000 dead in an instant, comparable to the worst firebombing raids, but accomplished with a single bomb from a single aircraft. If this weapon truly existed, if the Americans could produce them in quantity, then every assumption about Japan's defensive strategy became void. There would be no last stand on the beaches, no grinding battle of attrition. The Americans could simply drop atomic bombs on every city until Japan ceased to exist. But Anami also understood something else. The atomic bomb, for all its horror, was ultimately just another bomb. A bigger bomb, certainly, more destructive than any previous weapon, but still just a bomb that killed a certain number of people in a certain area. The Americans couldn't have many of them. Such weapons must be incredibly difficult to produce. They had used one on Hiroshima to demonstrate their power. They might have one or two more. But they couldn't have hundreds. They couldn't have thousands. The firebombing, though, that was different. That was an industrial process. That was something the Americans could sustain indefinitely. They had already burned 67 cities. They could burn 100 more, 200 more. They had the bombers, the napalm, the industrial capacity to continue the campaign until every urban area in Japan was ash. The atomic bomb was a terror weapon, a demonstration, something meant to shock and awe. But the real threat, the existential threat, remained what it had always been: fire. Systematic, methodical, industrial-scale fire that was consuming Japan city by city. On the 9th of August, the Americans dropped a second atomic bomb, this time on Nagasaki. 46,000 dead. And on the same day, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria with overwhelming force. The combination was too much. The atomic bombs provided a pretext, a way to surrender without admitting that the conventional firebombing campaign had already broken Japan's ability to resist. Better to say you surrendered because of an extraordinary new weapon than to admit you surrendered because your cities were burning and you had no way to stop it. On the 15th of August, Emperor Hirohito broadcast the news of Japan's surrender to the nation. In his speech, he cited the new and most cruel bomb as a reason for ending the war. It was a face-saving formula that allowed the military leadership to claim they had been defeated by supernatural means, rather than simply overwhelmed by superior industrial capacity. But the soldiers who had fought on Okinawa, who had been burned out of their caves by flame tanks, they knew the truth. The officers who had watched their cities burn, who had seen entire neighborhoods reduced to ash by thousands of tons of napalm, they knew the truth. The truth was that Japan had been defeated by fire, by napalm, by a jellied gasoline compound invented in a Harvard chemistry lab and produced in quantities that defied imagination, by flame tanks that turned defensive positions into ovens, by incendiary bombs that created firestorms hot enough to melt metal. The atomic bombs had killed, at most, 150,000 people. The firebombing campaign had killed 300,000 and rendered 8 million homeless. The atomic bombs had destroyed 2 cities. The firebombing campaign had destroyed 67 cities and counting. If you were a Japanese military commander in 1945, which weapon should you have feared more? The atomic bomb that might fall on your city, that the Americans might have 2 or 3 of? Or the napalm that was definitely coming, that the Americans had millions of pounds of, that had already destroyed most of urban Japan? The answer was obvious. The atomic bombs were terrible. But napalm was everywhere. Napalm had been burning Japanese soldiers alive since Saipan. Napalm had consumed Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, and 63 other cities. Napalm was the weapon that had actually defeated Japan. The atomic bombs just provided a better story. Colonel Yahara survived the war. He spent the remaining decades of his life analyzing what had gone wrong, trying to understand how Japan's military leadership had so catastrophically misjudged the nature of modern warfare. In his memoirs, published years later, he returned again and again to a single image: the American flame tanks on Okinawa, rolling forward with their streams of fire, systematically clearing cave after cave, while Japanese soldiers died screaming. "We prepared for the wrong war," he wrote. "We thought we could defeat the Americans through superior spirit, through willingness to die. We did not understand that they had found a way to make our willingness to die irrelevant. They simply burned us out of our positions, and no amount of courage could stand against it." The historical record supports Yahara's assessment. The most comprehensive post-war studies of the American strategic bombing campaign against Japan concluded that the firebombing had been far more effective at destroying Japan's war-making capacity than either the atomic bombs or the conventional high-explosive bombing that preceded it. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, conducted immediately after the war, found that the incendiary attacks had destroyed 40% of the built-up area of 66 major Japanese cities, killed between 300,000 and 330,000 civilians, and left 8 million homeless. Industrial production had been cut in half. Transportation infrastructure was crippled. Food distribution had broken down to the point that widespread starvation was imminent. By contrast, the atomic bombs, while achieving unprecedented destruction with single weapons, had killed fewer people overall and destroyed only 2 cities. Had the war continued, the firebombing campaign would have consumed the rest of urban Japan long before enough atomic weapons could be produced to have a comparable effect. Yet it was the atomic bombs that entered historical consciousness as the defining weapons of the war's end. The firebombing campaign, despite its far greater destructive impact, faded into relative obscurity, particularly in the West. Why? Partially because the atomic bombs were novel. They represented a new kind of destructive power, the dawn of the nuclear age. There was a drama to them that conventional weapons, even in unprecedented quantities, couldn't match. But also because the atomic bombs provided a convenient narrative. For the Japanese, surrendering in the face of atomic weapons was more acceptable than admitting they had been systematically defeated by conventional means. For the Americans, the atomic bombs justified the decision to end the war without an invasion. For both sides, emphasizing the role of atomic weapons allowed them to avoid uncomfortable questions about the ethics of strategic bombing campaigns that deliberately targeted civilian populations. The men who experienced the fire, though, the soldiers who fought against flame tanks, the civilians who survived the firebombing raids, they understood which weapon had truly broken Japan. In the decades after the war, researchers conducting oral history interviews with Japanese veterans consistently found a pattern. When asked about their experiences, soldiers who had faced American flame weapons exhibited more traumatic symptoms and more vivid recall than soldiers who had experienced conventional combat. A study conducted by researchers at Tokyo University in the 1980s interviewed 140 veterans of the Pacific War. The interviews revealed something striking. Veterans who had encountered American flame tanks or been present during firebombing raids were significantly more likely to report nightmares, anxiety, and intrusive memories than veterans who had been present at Hiroshima or Nagasaki after the atomic bombings. This wasn't because the atomic bombs were less terrible. The immediate effects on survivors were catastrophic, and radiation sickness was a horror beyond description. But the atomic bombings were single events. They happened once, and then they were over. Survivors either died or recovered. The suffering was intense but contained in time. The fire was different. The fire was everywhere. It had pursued soldiers from cave to cave on Pacific islands. It had rained down on cities night after night for months. It was inescapable, inexorable, methodical. And because it continued over time, because soldiers experienced it repeatedly, it created a different kind of trauma, one based not on a single overwhelming shock, but on prolonged, repeated exposure to a specific type of horror. One veteran, a former infantry sergeant who had fought on both Iwo Jima and Okinawa, described it this way. The atomic bomb was something beyond understanding. It was like an act of God, terrible, but not something you could have prevented or fought against. But the flame tanks, those we faced every day. Every time we took up position in a cave, we knew they were coming. We could hear them. We could smell the napalm before we saw the fire. And we absolutely knew, that when they found us, we would burn. That knowledge, day after day, was worse than any single moment of combat. The psychological impact on Japanese civilians was similarly profound. Survivors of the firebombing raids, the ones who had fled through streets turned into corridors of flame, who had watched their families burn, who had hidden in shelters while the temperature rose to unbearable levels, carried those memories with them for the rest of their lives. Haruyo Nihei, who was 8 years old during the March 9th raid on Tokyo, spoke about her experiences more than 70 years later with a clarity that suggested the memories had never faded. People ask me about the atomic bombs, and they were terrible, truly terrible. But for those of us who lived through the firebombing, that was our atomic bomb. That was our moment when the world ended. I can still smell the smoke. I can still see the river full of bodies. I can still hear the children screaming. That never goes away. The physical evidence supported the survivors' accounts. Post-war reconstruction efforts found that areas destroyed by firebombing were more difficult to rebuild than areas destroyed by conventional high-explosive bombs. The intense heat had not just destroyed structures, but had literally fused the rubble together in some places, creating a kind of artificial stone that had to be broken up before reconstruction could begin. In Tokyo's Koto and Sumida wards, where the March 9th firebombing had been most intense, workers clearing the ruins discovered that the asphalt in streets had melted and flowed like water, creating strange frozen waves of blackened material. Metal beams from buildings had sagged and twisted into bizarre shapes. Underground shelters where people had taken refuge had become furnaces, baking those inside alive when the temperature rose, to levels that turned the air itself into poison. The Americans, for their part, were well aware of what they had done. Curtis LeMay, who had commanded the strategic bombing campaign, was unapologetic. "I suppose if I had lost the war, I would have been tried as a war criminal," he said in later interviews. "Fortunately, we were on the winning side." Robert McNamara, who had worked on the targeting analysis for the firebombing campaign, was more conflicted. In his memoir and documentary, The Fog of War, he acknowledged that the systematic destruction of Japanese cities through incendiary bombing constituted war crimes by any reasonable definition, but argued that the imperative to end the war quickly justified actions that would otherwise be unconscionable. The debate over the ethics of strategic bombing would continue for decades, with no clear resolution. But for the Japanese military commanders who had lived through the war, the ethical questions were less important than the tactical reality. The Americans had found a weapon, or rather, a combination of weapon and delivery system, that made traditional defensive strategies obsolete. Napalm had done what conventional explosives could not. It had turned Japan's prepared defensive positions into death traps. It had made caves into ovens. It had rendered urban areas impossible to defend because the buildings themselves became fuel for firestorms that no amount of preparation could prevent. And most importantly, the Americans had demonstrated that they possessed the industrial capacity to produce and deliver this weapon in quantities that Japan could not match or counter. By the war's end, American factories were producing napalm faster than they could ship it to the Pacific. There was never any shortage. There was never any concern about running out. Compare this to the atomic bomb program. The Manhattan Project had required 3 years, $2 billion, and the efforts of some of the world's leading scientists to produce 3 functional weapons, 1 for testing, 2 for use in combat. The program was extraordinarily expensive and complex. Producing additional weapons required rare materials and sophisticated manufacturing processes. Napalm, by contrast, required aluminum naphthenate and palm oil mixed with gasoline, materials that were readily available and easy to process. The manufacturing was straightforward enough that it could be done in relatively simple facilities. And the delivery system was nothing more than conventional bombs filled with the mixture and dropped from existing aircraft. From a strategic perspective, napalm was the superior weapon. It was cheaper, easier to produce, easier to deliver, and more reliably effective against the types of targets that mattered in the Pacific War. The atomic bombs were revolutionary in their destructive potential, but they were also rare and difficult to manufacture. Napalm was revolutionary in its effectiveness and could be produced and deployed in unlimited quantities. This was the calculus that Japanese commanders understood by the summer of 1945. The atomic bombs might destroy 2 cities, maybe 3 or 4 if the Americans had more in reserve, but the napalm would destroy every city eventually. The atomic bombs were a risk. The napalm was a certainty. In the final analysis, the question of why Japanese commanders feared napalm more than atomic bombs comes down to 3 factors: familiarity, frequency, and inevitability. Familiarity. By August of 1945, Japanese military personnel had extensive experience with American flame weapons. They had faced flame tanks on Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. They had watched cities burn from one end of Japan to the other. They understood exactly what napalm could do, how it behaved, why it was so difficult to defend against. The atomic bomb, by contrast, was unknown until it was used. It was terrible when it arrived, but it was also unprecedented, something that existed outside of normal experience. Frequency. Napalm attacks were constant. Flame tanks appeared at every defensive position in the Pacific Island battles. Firebombing raids struck Japanese cities night after night, week after week for months. A soldier or civilian in 1945 would encounter napalm or its effects repeatedly, creating cumulative trauma and a sense of inescapability. The atomic bombs, by contrast, were used exactly twice. They were catastrophic events, but they were also singular. If you weren't at Hiroshima or Nagasaki, you didn't experience them directly. Inevitability. This was perhaps the most important factor. By mid-1945, Japanese commanders knew with certainty that more napalm attacks were coming. They could see American B-29s overhead every night. They could track the systematic destruction of one city after another. They knew that flame tanks would be part of any battle on the remaining Pacific Islands or on the Japanese home islands themselves. The napalm was inevitable. It was simply a matter of when, not if. The atomic bombs, by contrast, carried an element of uncertainty. How many did the Americans have? How often could they use them? Would they really drop atomic bombs on every city, or were they reserving them for special circumstances? Japanese commanders couldn't know the answers to these questions, and uncertainty, paradoxically, made the atomic bombs less psychologically oppressive than the napalm. You can prepare psychologically for something certain, even if you can't prevent it. You can accept that death by fire is coming and steel yourself for it. But the napalm didn't just promise eventual death, it promised it repeatedly, in every defensive position, in every cave, in every city that remained standing. The psychological weight of that certainty was enormous. Consider the position of a Japanese infantry officer in August of 1945. He has survived Okinawa. He has seen flame tanks burn through defensive positions that were supposed to be impregnable. He has been ordered to help prepare the defense of Kyushu against the expected American invasion. He knows that when the Americans come, they will bring flame tanks, hundreds of them. He knows that the caves and bunkers being prepared will become ovens. He knows that his men will die by fire, screaming, unable to fight back effectively because the Americans can stand off at a distance and simply burn them out. Now someone tells him that the Americans have a new weapon, an atomic bomb, that destroyed Hiroshima in a single flash. It's terrible, certainly, unprecedented. But it destroyed one city, and there are hundreds of cities in Japan. The odds of the atomic bomb falling specifically on his position seem relatively low. But the flame tanks? Those are definitely coming. Those are certain. Which weapon should he fear more? The answer from a rational perspective is clear, and Japanese military commanders were nothing if not rational in their assessment of threats. They feared the weapon that would definitely kill them, that they had seen kill thousands of their comrades, that they knew would be deployed systematically and in overwhelming numbers. They feared napalm. The irony is that history remembers the atomic bombs as the weapons that ended World War II. In popular consciousness, in historical texts, in commemorations and memorials, it is Hiroshima and Nagasaki that symbolize the conclusion of the Pacific War. The mushroom cloud has become the defining image of the war's end. But the Japanese soldiers who fought in the Pacific, the commanders who planned the defense of the home islands, the civilians who survived the firebombing raids, they remember a different weapon. They remember the smell of napalm. They remember the sound of flame tanks. They remember the night sky turned orange with burning cities. If you had asked a Japanese military officer in August of 1945 what weapon he feared most, he would not have said atomic bombs. He might not have even known what atomic bombs were until after they were used, but he would have known about napalm. Everyone knew about napalm by then. It was the fire that haunted them, the fire that had pursued them from island to island, the fire that had consumed their cities, the fire that made defense impossible and resistance futile. The atomic bomb was the exclamation point at the end of the war, but napalm was the weapon that wrote the sentence, and in the end, it was the sentence that mattered, not the punctuation. Colonel Yahara understood this. In his final years, he gave occasional interviews to historians studying the Pacific War. One interviewer asked him directly, "Were you more afraid of the atomic bomb or the napalm?" Yahara's answer was immediate. The napalm, without question. The atomic bomb was terrible, but it was also theoretical until it was used. The napalm was real. It killed my soldiers every day. It burned our cities every night. When I close my eyes, I see fire. Always fire. That is what defeated us. Not the atomic bomb, the fire. And he was right. Japan surrendered because continuing the war had become impossible. The nation's cities were destroyed. Its industrial capacity was shattered. Its military had been burned out of defensive positions from Okinawa to Kyushu. The atomic bombs provided a dramatic conclusion and a face-saving reason to accept defeat. but the defeat itself had been accomplished through the systematic application of fire. The American strategic bombing campaign, using napalm-based incendiary weapons, had proven that modern industrial warfare could destroy a nation's capacity to resist without ever engaging its military forces in decisive battle. The flame tanks had proven that technological superiority could make courage and determination irrelevant in combat. These were the lessons that Japanese commanders learned and feared. When we ask why Japanese commanders feared napalm more than atomic bombs, we're really asking, why did they fear the weapon they faced every day more than the weapon they heard about in reports? Why did they fear the certain threat more than the possible one? Why did they fear the weapon that had already killed hundreds of thousands more than the weapon that might kill hundreds of thousands in the future? The answer seems obvious when stated plainly, but it has been obscured by decades of historical focus on the atomic bombs, focus that, while understandable, given the revolutionary nature of nuclear weapons, has inadvertently minimized the role that conventional incendiary warfare played in Japan's defeat. The truth is that if atomic bombs had never been invented, Japan would still have surrendered in 1945. The firebombing campaign would have continued. More cities would have burned. Eventually, the combination of urban destruction, industrial collapse, and military exhaustion would have forced Japan's government to accept defeat. The atomic bombs accelerated that outcome and provided a dramatic narrative. But the outcome itself was determined by fire, by napalm, by the weapon that Japanese commanders had learned to fear above all others, by the weapon that, unlike the atomic bomb, they knew with absolute certainty would be used against them, again and again and again, until either they surrendered or Japan ceased to exist. That certainty, that knowledge of what was coming, was more terrifying than any hypothetical superweapon. And that is why Japanese commanders feared napalm more than atomic bombs. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.